that the enemy is necessary for the development of the personality.
I'm being misunderstood. I'm not advocating nationalism at all. It's quite the contrary.
We don't have to continue equating the race part with the culture part. Are you ready to explore something different? Something more? On Straight Ahead, hosts Aryeh Tepper and I
examine sources of cultural vitality, from jazz music to the Jewish tradition. If you're searching for generous and soulful approaches to contemporary challenges,
join us for Straight Ahead, the Omni-American podcast. Welcome to Straight Ahead, the Omni-American podcast. I'm Greg Thomas, joined by my worthy constituent, as Charlie Parker would say of Dizzy Gillespie, Aryeh Tepper.
Bird, it's good to see you this week.
This taping that we did, this conversation we had with Glenn Loury, took place before the events in the Middle East on October 7th, which impacted you. So since we're doing this intro subsequent to that, I'd like to ask you, how are you doing and how are things in Ofakim?
Right. Thank you, Greg. Ofakim, it's still, all of this, of course, is too big for words. Ofakim lost 50 people who were murdered. A lot of those people who were murdered, they on their own, when the state wasn't here, went out and defended all of us. And now the city has come up with kind of a slogan, which people are wearing on their shirts and putting on bumper stickers or signs, which is Ir Shel Giborim, which means city of heroes. And it's a testimony, a reflection of the resilience and the heroism of the people from a very difficult, dark day on October 7th.
Okay. Well, thanks for that brief update. And yes, the city of heroes. It sounds very appropriate to me.
Yeah. So, it's appropriate for this episode because, and I don't throw around the term hero lightly. I don't throw around terms lightly. And to call someone heroic, we're not all, we people like to flatter themselves with virtues, but Glenn Loury, it's fitting to call him, he's a courageous intellectual. He's a courageous person. He's courageous in terms of, he's not afraid of asking difficult questions, and he's not afraid of taking a principled stand. He's not afraid to leave his comfort zone intellectually and learn new things. And all of this came out in our conversation with him, which I really enjoyed. I'm really happy he came and he joined us for this conversation. And knowing that he's, so I came out swinging, and I asked him a question about the soul and the limitations of looking at everything in terms of economics. But how about maybe you can share with the audience, what themes did we touch upon in our conversation?
Well, we began with talking about the purpose and limits of economics, his very profession, and the question of the soul. We talked about respectfully. We resumed a debate that he and I have been having about deracialization, and we connected it to a concept called transracial humanism. We talked about the bias versus development narrative in Black American life. We compared and contrasted elements of Black American life and Jewish American life. And we also talked about the meaning of Omni-American.
Right. I really enjoyed the conversation. It was, it was lively. It was popping a little bit. And
I think the audience will enjoy it. So
absolutely.
Here goes. Welcome to the show, Glenn.
Hey, great. Good to be with you.
Okay. Now, we certainly appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule to be our guest. And I've been a guest on your show a few times to discuss race and culture, music, and life. And we've even engaged in a debate on your Substack on the topic of deracialization. So we intend to continue those themes here, but we want to begin with your own discipline, economics. I'll ask you a question that, I don't know, may be provocative, may be insulting, and don't mean to be, or may just be a softball for you. Is economics really a dismal science?
No, I don't think so. Although we are called the dismal science because it falls to us to deliver the bad news that there's no free lunch, We're the guy that has to come around and say you want to do something. Well, if you do that, you can't do this. Or, not all problems have solutions, not resources are scarce, this kind of idea. So that's why we get the name the dismal science. But no, I mean, we could get down to cases, but I think economics is a very lively, intellectually deep social science. It's one of the social sciences. Everything is not economics. There are other streams of investigation ongoing. But I don't think there's anything particularly dismal about economics.
Well, if I can, let me push back a little bit. We can have perhaps a deeper critique of the dismal character of economics if we go back, if we connect economics to the foundation of modernity, when we have this Machiavellian turn to the effectual truth, which is when we're thinking about the good of human beings, let's please abstract from the soul. Let's put that aside. That brings us the Inquisition. It's not productive. And let's accept people as they are, which is they want comfort and security, and they're going to pursue. That's the main engine for if we're going to take people as they are, we're going to need to see the passions in charge. And we need to forget about this larger ennobling vision of what it means to be a human being. That would also be a critique of economics, the roots of economics as the dismal science. How would you respond to that?
I would say that's above my pay grade, man. I mean, you're onto the meaning of life. No, economics doesn't give an answer to that question. What is the meaning of life? I mean, here's how I think about it.
Right.
If they're selling something over here at a price that's lower than what it's being sold at over there, somebody is going to get in the business of buying low over here, selling high over there. The force of that activity will cause the prices to come into equality with one another. So it's not a stable situation for it to be cheap over here and expensive over here. Okay.
Right.
That's not quite the meaning of life.
No.
It's more on the order of water runs downhill.
Right.
But it's true. It's true.
Yeah, it is.
Okay. It's worth knowing. Doesn't answer every question, but it does tell us about the equilibrating forces of arbitrage. Now, over here and over there, we could be selling food, or we could be selling securities, or whatever. The same kind of tendency is going to be at play. Take that and multiply it by 10,000 or 100,000. There's just a lot of insight in doing that. That's what economics is. It's not everything. Economics is not the answer to every question. And as far as this issue of, the nobler soul, the one who's not enmeshed in the gritty, material, acquisitive, whatever. I mean, okay, write a novel.
There you go.
But don't mess with my tax rate with that kind of,
Right.
Do you see what I'm saying? I'm trying to defend the science, the science of analytically, empirically, logically, systematically trying to answer the question, if I make the tax rate 40% on people who make over $200,000 a year, what will happen to the gross national product? That's a fair question. It's an important question. That's what economists do.
I think that's the very deep response, which is that if you take this immaterial thing and you let it intervene in lawmaking and the way we set up, if that's going to intervene in personal freedom in the market, you're going to screw everything up. So please don't do that. That has to be reserved for a different realm.
Well, speaking of realms, you mentioned that economics is a social science. And you said, write a novel. That's, humanities, literature.
I was being a little flippant. Okay.
No, that's okay. No, that's okay. Because, and that's the thing that I know about you and others know about you, Professor Loury, is that you may be an economist as a profession, as a scholar, but that your interests go, beyond economics. I know that you love jazz. I know that you don't just read economic treatises, that you're a man who appreciates literature and such. So, in fact, I remember I was talking to Albert Murray once, and I asked him, because he was very, like Ralph Ellison, he was very critical of the social sciences. So I asked him one time, I said, listen, well, okay, you're very critical of social science. Okay, tell me a social scientist who you think is good. He says someone like Max Weber, because of how well-rounded Weber was, for example. And I think that you may epitomize that too, Glenn.
Well, I appreciate that. I take that as a high compliment. I really do appreciate it. I was just going to say, I was being a little defensive, I think, in my earlier reaction, because I get this all the time about how economics is whatever. And as you say, I do have broad interests, so I'm coming into contact with people in humanities and in other social sciences all the time, and historians and people like that. I was going to say, a retort to my defense of economics might have been, Aryeh, you can tell me about price equilibration, but you can't tell me about value.
Okay, that's Weber. There you go.
Okay, you can't tell me what something is worth. You can tell me what it costs, but you can't tell me what it's worth. Economics, so they say this about Adam Smith. They say there's The Wealth of Nations, and this is the kind of canonical free market treatise. But they say there's also a theory of moral sentiments, which is an inquiry into value. And a person could say, water running downhill is something worth knowing, but it's not the answer to the most important questions. The most important questions have to do with what's worth dying for. Why are we here? What is virtue? What is courage? Things like that. And it could be that economistic thinking with the green eye shade gets in the way of the fullest exploration of those things. It could be that the accountant comes in and says, look, here's how we can make money, but it requires destroying a way of life or a form of art or something like that. And there's no way of economics reaching to the real question of what is value. So, I accept that economics is limited. I'm defending the utility of it to that extent. But when the Economist, Larry Summers, an economist, I heard him say this, and I thought it was wise, actually. He said, you want them on tap, not on top. You want the green eye shade guy on tap to consult, but not on top, not running the show. Right. And so when economists get to running the show on economistic principle to the exclusion of humanistic value. So I'm answering both sides. I'm making both sides of the argument.
And that's another thing I like about you, Glenn. And you do this on your show. You do the devil's advocate is one way of putting it, or being able to explain in fair terms and even generous terms what the other side of an argument actually says. And that shows a certain, I would say, heartfelt, soul-felt, and mindful capacity to be generous enough to do that. And I think that's crucial for democratic dialogue, generally speaking. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, and I appreciate the compliment. The steel manning thing is, I think, really very important. I agree about a kind of epistemic modesty and a kind of ability to listen. You can't make the other side's argument unless you're listening to them.
That's right. That's right.
You first have to hear them out before you can make the argument. Even if you're not persuaded by it, you have to hear them out, and listening and a kind of commitment to the enterprise of exchange of ideas that it transcends or is prior to winning the fight. I got the better of him, that kind of thing.
Exactly.
So, yeah, I try to embody that as best I can.
All right. Okay. So now maybe we'll get into some areas where we can engage in some antagonistic cooperation.
Well, you mentioned that we had an exchange at Substack, and I kind of vaguely remember it, but I don't remember all the details. You want to remind me?
Sure. Well, when I was on your show last end of December, and I think it came out early January 2023, I was on with you and John McWhorter, and I was making a case for deracialization, a case that is not equivalent to color blindness, not equivalent to putting one's head in the sand about past or present racism. It's a case that's somewhat aligned with a principle that you posit that I agree with, transracial humanism. And I think deracialization is a way to get to transracial humanism eventually. And basically, the argument is that racialization is a process through which races are created. And race is a concept that came into being in the 1700s, where we, of course, as human beings, categorize. It's a part of our cognitive function. We have to be able to place things, objects into different categories. But what happens is racialization is a process through which we select and sort based on phenotypic characteristics, for one thing, and then create certain oppositions, white, black, coiled hair, straight hair, thick nose, thin nose, European, African, and create a hierarchy based on that, right? Where the European, or those who are racialized as white, are on top, and those who are racialized as black are on bottom. And then certain stereotypes come into being, and then essentialization happens. I learned about essentialization during graduate work in NYU in the late 90s, where it's natural. You're just born that way. And then finally that turns into action based on those supposed immutable differences, racism. So,
okay, so aren't we all against the process that you just got through describing?
I would say so. I mean, Aryeh, would you say you're against that?
Absolutely.
Okay.
So how could I have been on the other side of that argument?
Well, I hadn't finished completely making the argument yet or laying it out.
No wonder I have no recollection of it.
Because you agree with that.
Well, I have some things to say, but go ahead.
Okay, thank you. And I think where we differed, basically, is that I make a clear distinction between race, the process of creating races, racialization, a racial worldview, and culture, cultural intelligence, a cultural worldview. I make a clear distinction because I think analytically it's very important to make that distinction so we don't conflate the two. And I think the beautiful, positive, generative aspects of Black American culture that you love and identify with, from the music to the dance to the food to our style, all of that is something that I put in the cultural realm. Now, okay, I'm going to make a concession. The concession is that we were in an environment of racial domination. And it was in that environment through which we created the culture that we find so fructifying, that we find so wonderful and generative. And that's influenced the world. I don't deny that. What I'm saying that is now, we don't have to continue equating the race part with the culture part. And I think that was where we had some differences.
Okay. I'm reliving some of the feelings that I had when we had that conversation.
Okay.
Because this is not quite a coherent, in no way is it meant to be a rebuttal, but it's just a kind of visceral thing of, why am I doing this? Okay, so race is bad. Race is the evil thing. It's the bugaboo. Race.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a Black man. The only reason I'm having this conversation about race is because I'm a Black man. I guess you're going to call that culture. I guess you're going to say that my choice of this woman with darker skin who's going to have my children if she's willing, and that one with a Caucasian look, and I want to marry, quote unquote, within the race. And I guess that's going to be somehow kind of reductive and believing in a false God or something like that. The meanings that I'm attaching to this, the meanings, the significance, the significations.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, that's not a theory of essentialism. And it could be called a cultural reaction. Every society will have people who come to the point of, let's say, choosing who their mates are, or what they're going to work on in their life, or where they're going to give their money to support the cause, or what histories, what narratives they attach them. That's something. And if it just happens that I'm interested in W.E.B. Du Bois' Souls of Black Folks, and I read it and I think, my people. Okay. It just so happens that correlates with this. You're going to call that culture, and you're going to say we're not in the race business. And I'm like, it feels like splitting hairs to me. It feels like it feels in a quixotic in a way, because the thing is so, damn, I going to tell the Jews don't be Jewish?
Well, this is something.
Oh, but that's not race. That's not race. That's culture. You're going to tell me, except if I want to get into Israel, I got to get past some rabbis who are going to ask me who my mother was. And please don't misunderstand me. I'm not singling out the Jews. I'm not against people saying marry a Jewish woman and have Jewish children. Please, my son. I'm not against people saying that. I'm just saying they're not bigots for saying that. Right. And neither is a black man who says Malcolm X.
Right.
He's not deluded.
Right. And that's not my point of delusion. I would just say, and this is interesting because it allows us to get into maybe some more of the nuances. Like back, you mentioned Du Bois, Alain Locke. At that time, they, proud black men and women call themselves race men and women because race was something that was imposed on us. There's no question. And I think this is a key point that I didn't make that I want to make now. We are a people. We are an ethno-cultural group, no question, with a certain history, with traditions that have been built. There's no question. I'm just saying that I can maintain and admit all of that without myself holding on to the concept of race, the process of racialization, and a way of seeing the world as a racial worldview. I don't have to attach myself to that. Now, Glenn, if you want to, that's your choice. I mean, I am about definitely giving people the choice, but I'm trying to make a case that for us to get to transracial humanism, the transracial part will be assisted by us consciously making a distinction between race and culture, disavowing race per se, embracing culture, embracing peoplehood, embracing history. Because otherwise, I think we stay on this merry-go-round, and I don't see us being able to get to transracial humanism without something like a deracialization.
We should define transracial humanism.
Yes. And since you used the term, if you wouldn't mind, could you do that?
Well, it's a commitment to the infinite worth of every person, regardless of quote unquote their race. It's a vision of the self that is not truncated or limited by feeling that it has to be within a certain box. I mean, what language do I learn? And who do I marry? I mean, and how do I live my life? It does invite me to eschew a parochial and kind of derivative sense of my citizenship or my being, something like that. It says there's a realm above this identitarian realm.
Right.
There's a human realm.
Right.
And it transcends my loyalties to my tribe are real, but they're not the ultimate loyalty. Something like that,
Thank you. Aryeh, you want to get in here? And since you are the Jewish person amongst us, and since Glenn alluded to your people.
Well,
just as an example, but okay.
Oh, no, absolutely. But that's the same example that you used on the show. You mentioned someone who Aryeh is an expert on. Yeah. Leo Strauss.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. Dr. Aryeh Tepper. Matter of fact, if you would, for Glenn and the audience, if you would give a little of your background and your relation to Leo Strauss, whom Glenn quoted in terms of his Jewish identity when I was on his show.
Right. So Glenn is referring to an article it's a transcription of a talk he gave at Hillel in Chicago called
Right.
"Why We Remain Jews," and
Right.
that's what he's riffing on, and responding to using. My master's degree and my PhD were dedicated to the Guide for the Perplexed, Maimonides' classic Guide for the Perplexed, 12th century Andalusian theological, philosophical, theological classic. And Leo Strauss was one of the great interpreters of the Guide in the 20th century. He's really determined to a large extent the language, the vocabulary that is used in certain circles for investigating the Guide. And that's not uncontroversial because traditionalists really push back against Strauss's interpretation. They accuse him of having read Aristotle, Platonic political philosophy into the Jewish tradition. But let's put that aside. So I'm very familiar with Strauss, and I lived with Strauss for 7 years while I was working on my PhD, which became the book Progressive Minds, Conservative Politics, Leo Strauss's later writings on Maimonides. And it took me about a decade before I was willing to look at Strauss again, because that was, and by the way, I only wrote the PhD and I wrote the book because I had an existential need. I didn't aim to become an academic. I had an existential need because of my particular situation within the Jewish community to have some type of mastery over the Guide of the Perplexed, to have some type of familiarity with what can be considered an axis of the Jewish tradition. To get back to what you were saying about comparing the Jews and Black Americans, perhaps one way it sounds to me, Greg, like you're looking at Black peoplehood as a stage that will ultimately be transcended. Whereas if I'm hearing Glenn correctly, you're saying, no, this is a fixed part of reality which we can transcend in our cosmopolitan, transhumanistic, when we meet at the top, when we meet on the level of human excellence. But we're never going to we shouldn't even aim to transcend that more rooted experience. Maybe I'm hearing you wrong, Greg.
Well, yeah, I would say there's a slight, in integral philosophy, which I'm a student of, there is a concept of transcending while including. So one can be cosmopolitan, yet remain rooted at the same time. Rooted cosmopolitanism, as you know, Aryeh, that's one of my key philosophical precepts. So yeah, I can be a Black American in ethnocultural terms, but I can also be a human and relate to and identify with humanity. I can even go out into the mystical land and relate to the cosmos and the universe itself. But I'm still a Black American with a certain, lineage and history and traditions. So I don't see those as contradictory. So that's my clarification. But I want Glenn to say what he would have to say regarding what you said. And I really wanted to hear you more talk, because this whole Jewish American, Black American comparison and contrasting is really kind of key to the Omni-American Future Project, which this podcast is an expression of. So
I will say a couple of things. I have a student named David Sachs. He was an undergraduate, finished a couple of years ago here at Brown. He's at Stanford Law now. And he and I, when he was an undergraduate, created a seminar that he co-taught with me. He was my undergraduate TA, called Free Inquiry in the Modern World. And we, in that seminar, read some text. I won't go on too long. We started with Plato. We included John Milton's defense against the licensing of books by the Crown, the Areopagitica, and John Stuart Mill. And then we moved into the 20th century, and amongst our readings was Persecution in the Art of Writing, Leo Strauss,
right?
Wherein he talks about reading Maimonides and Spinoza and whatnot. Now, right. I don't know from, okay, this is not my field. I'm not going to pretend to any, but I just found it as something of a coincidence that then I'd be talking to Aryeh. And yeah, that essay of Strauss's, that talk that's in this collection of Strauss's writings, really struck me because I thought it was a good question. He says, why do we remain Jews? And I thought the answer was a pretty good answer. He says, lest I betray my forebears. And besides, they won't let me not be Jews anyway. I was thinking about that, and I was thinking about your statement, Greg, that you affirmed that African Americans are, quote unquote, a people, and Jews are a people. The other thing I want to say is I got an invitation to speak at a high-end synagogue in Palm Beach, Florida, from one of these hedge fund guys that is, and he wants me to come down there and talk about whatever happened to the collaboration between Blacks and Jews in American politics. So
you point them to the Omni-American Future Project. You say that's one example.
I need help. I need help.
Okay. Well, we got you, man. We got you.
Well, I think that we can link these parts together if we look. What's lost in the racialization when systemic racism is our bias narrative, or when we have racialization as the narrative through which we see American society and culture? What's of the most deepest value that's lost? And this also might be because there's other factors at play as well. I think that perhaps the specialization, and Professor Loury is a welcome exception to the rule of most people think in terms of specialization. They're often, they know their field, but they're not interested in reading beyond their field. And reality is interdisciplinary, and that's how for the sake of getting at some of reality, we have to move beyond the specialization. But because specialization is so dominant in our intellectual fields, and especially in academia, we've lost sight of the importance of having a comprehensive perspective. That as the architectonic principle. We want the economists on tap. We don't want them on top. That how are we going to have an architectonic principle for understanding reality? And what type of human being is the ideal human being? And if we say that we're going to aim for a more comprehensive perspective, and the ideal human being is someone who develops all of his or her powers, intellectual, physical, emotional, etc. If that's our vision of the good, if we lose that, if we lose sight of that, we don't have the tools to appreciate what's so great about Ralph Ellison. When Ralph Ellison introduces us in Shadow and Act, in the introduction, he says, I was in Oklahoma, the chaos of Oklahoma. And within the chaos of Oklahoma, the idea of the Renaissance man trickled down to me. And I just I naively applied that, the aspiration to mastery and creativity. Where else in America do we hear that? Who else talks like that?
That's a question to me.
That led me to that. Yeah. And so when...
Well, that was above my pay grade, so it's got to be for you, Glenn.
But when we racialize and we don't have the tool. When we racialize and specialize, we don't have the tools to appreciate that Black American culture is that which we can extend it to the jazz tradition as well. Has the tools, the internal tools, the idiomatic particulars, which have a vision, a Native American vision of this transhuman excellence.
Okay, so I'm thinking the Voting Rights Act. So they're drawing congressional districts in Alabama. I don't know how closely you all might be following the political this and that. And there's a challenge because they could have drawn 2 majority Black districts, which would have given Democrats more chances of winning seats in Alabama because it's a conservative state, but the Blacks vote Democratic. But it would have also, some argue, been more consistent with the Voting Rights Act, which says that, in effect, you have to maximize the opportunity that African Americans have to vote for a candidate of their choice. So race, they're Black, the candidate of their choice, the district. So they're using demographic data to draw these districts to count the number of people in it who are this or who are that. So there's a Black woman sitting on the United States Supreme Court, Ketanji Brown Jackson. She was appointed by a man, a Democratic president, who said before he was elected that if he got elected, that's what he was going to do. I'm saying with great respect, horses out of the barn, man.
Yeah, I hear you. I mean, yeah.
You know, I mean, you can push on a string all you want to. You're not going to reweave the fabric by pushing on the string. We need a better strategy with great respect than the preachy, you know, can't we just all get beyond this thing, this, you know, whatever. Again, I mean, I'm just saying it. Horses out of the barn on this, on race.
Yeah, for sure. No argument.
But the horse was out of the barn when people believed in witches and they had the Salem witch trials, and we got beyond that. The horse was out of the barn when we had a feudal system where, you know, you had lords and kings. And of course, some of that is still in existence, but we evolved from that, you know?
I thought you said people weren't deluded if they got excited about a Black woman at the U.S. Supreme Court. I thought those feelings that they had of exaltation and pride were legitimate. I thought you said that they were legitimate. Are they deluded or not? They believe in witches? They believe in witches if they think Ketanji Brown Jackson is the fulfillment of some idealized notion about what it means to be included in America? They're mistaken?
No, I'm kind of alluding to the Field Sisters' racecraft, which alludes to witchcraft. But let me say this. If people feel pride and they see someone who looks like them, this is where I disagree with Camille Foster, who I agree with, I think is in many ways is very brilliant. He's a bit too individualistic in his libertarianism for my taste, but I agree with some of his, you know, race abolitionists, which he uses tongue in cheek. I think it's fine to feel pride, not just because Ketanji Brown Jackson looks like me and has a similar skin tone, which would kind of be a phenotypic racial thing, but because she has ascended to the highest reaches of our judicial system, and she was prepared to do so. Now, in the same way, Glenn, that you defend very strongly, and I've seen this, you know, Clarence Thomas and his legacy on the Supreme Court, and we, not just as Black Americans, but you think all Americans should be proud of that legacy. People can say that now Ms. Jackson has the same opportunity to have that type of longevity and create a legacy, though she's obviously coming from a different place, it seems, politically. That's fine. It's not a question of people being deluded. I'm not saying, and I'm not really trying to either preach at or look down upon those who still identify with race. When you go to the Mississippi example, we're talking about the use of racial categories in a place where those racial categories were used against people who are racialized as Black. So when we consider these things today moving forward, we can still take in consideration how people have been racialized. It's a fact. It still happens. We can acknowledge it. I'm not saying folks are dumb, stupid, deluded. No. All I'm saying is I'm trying to lay out an analytical case that there is a better way to conceive of oneself that doesn't confine oneself to racial categorization. But I do want to this is related. This is related. But see, Aryeh alluded to, you know, a narrative, a presentation that you gave at MIT, your alma mater, which, by the way, now is my daughter's alma mater. My daughter Kaya, who I spoke with you about on your show. And thank you. The bias versus the development narrative on different views of African-American disadvantage. That was the title of your presentation. So obviously we know narratives have primary value, you know, since humans use language and tell stories. And in that lecture, you referenced two colleagues in the economics fraternity, UC Berkeley's George Akerlof and Robert Schiller of Yale, who stressed the importance of narratives for understanding social outcomes. Can we transition into that discussion? Because I think that's a key, bias versus development narrative. Would you mind summarizing the thesis and so we could talk about that a bit? And of course, feel free to also comment on what we were talking about before.
No, we can move on. On the narrative thing, it's a literary kind of idea about storytelling, about the way in which you kind of narrate events. And the events in question are the events that are constituted by the position of African Americans in socioeconomic terms within society, the disadvantaged position, the underrepresented position, the subordinate position. So an account has to be given of that. And I was juxtaposing the account which says, in effect, by the way, I just went back and reread Stanley Crouch's 1987 review of Beloved.
Ooh. Yeah, that was a tough one.
And not to get us off point, but just the account of bias, of discrimination, of exclusion, of oppression.
Right.
Here we are, African Americans, bearing all of those scars and all of that weight and all of that, our ancestors enslaved, slavery, this unimaginable evil that was perpetrated against our people. And on and on and on and on and on
Jim
and
Crow.
on into the 21st century.
Right.
A century and a half after emancipation, a half century after the peak of the civil rights revolution in the 20th century, into the 21st century in a country that's so dynamic. Right. It says, but we have our narrative. If a white cop does something to a black kid, never mind whether or not the cop's whiteness had anything to do with what happened. It becomes a racial incident and becomes Emmett Till, 1955 or whatever. It becomes a familiar story about what black people have to do with the bias narrative. If our kids are behind in school, if there are too many of them in prison, if they're not making the same money, if they're not in tech, coding in tech land in Silicon Valley, it's because of bias. The narrative is absolutely compelling. When you're inside of that narrative and that's the lens through which you see the world, it's absolutely compelling. The development narrative is a different way of giving an account. It's a different way of telling the story. And it puts its stress not on the outside, not on what the environment has or hasn't bequeathed, but on the inside, about agency, about empowering oneself, about mastery. You were speaking of Ellison sitting in Oklahoma, about command over the environment that one helps to create for oneself. One's fate is not fully determined by the inheritance of whatever. One is an agent with free will and with possibilities. That's not to say you have to walk that road on your own, but it's to say if your focus is on development, on intellectual development, on the maintenance of social coherence within your most intimate relationships, on starting businesses, creating, being competitive and productive. That's a very different thing than if your focus is on keeping a litany and an account of what wrongs have been done for you and going around with your hand out saying, you must do, you must do, you must do. Totally different way of being in the world.
Right.
So I was advocating for the development narrative. I was saying, okay, for Black people now, I'm speaking of Black people. And in a certain way, I'm speaking to Black people. And I'm saying, forgive me for comparing myself to Leo Strauss, but just as Leo Strauss said, what do we owe to our forefathers? We owe them more than Al Sharpton. We owe them more than Ben Crump. I'm sorry. I'm just going to say it because there are implications. If you say transracial humanism, Greg, there are political implications. I don't think, frankly, me, Glenn Loury, and I call myself a race man, that the color of the left Democrat politician who happens to be representing a district has a whole lot to do with my understanding about my people, about their possibilities, about their future. I think it's a shell game where the color is being used and people being led around by the nose because they slavishly are, reacting to this thing that's kind of superficial. On the other hand, when I contemplate the poverty rate, the imprisonment rate, the SAT scores, the general well-being, the out of wedlock birth rate, the murder rate that's going on among my people, I feel agony about it. And part of that is because I identify as a Black man, and I'm not going to give that up. You haven't talked me out of that. Okay, good.
I'm not trying to.
So
I'm just trying to.
I'm relating the two things. I'm saying the bias narrative, the development narrative. There's a old school, also 20th century way of thinking about Black disadvantage, which is the bias story, which is true, but simply inadequate to the moment. And then there's this thing that I'm talking about, which is you're not on an island, you're a part of a society, but nevertheless, you got to get yourself together. You got to get moving. We have to get moving. What are we going to tell our children? Kind of thing like that, which I'm saying as a Black man.
And how can we honor?
Yes.
And how can we honor our ancestors? Albert Murray called it ancestral imperative. Now, I have a question. I'm going to know, Aryeh, get in there.
Yeah,
but after your question, I have what I think is a provocative question for Glenn that I don't know the answer to, but I'm going to ask it. But please, you go. Maybe you riff on it.
Let's talk a little bit about the Leo Strauss comparison, because I think it can be fruitful for seeing the limitations and the possibilities of comparing Jewish Americans to Black Americans.
That's where I wanted to go.
So the Jewish American, I begin with the premise. And first of all, I think that the fact that Professor Loury, that you're bringing in, that you are emphasizing storytelling.
And not just statistics in the quantitative dimension.
It's very important. And regarding the stories that we tell, Jewish Americans have a rather myopic perspective, by and large, about the meaning of Jewish identity. The Jewish Americans, for many reasons, the overwhelming majority of Jewish Americans are Ashkenazi Jews, and they've had a particular historical experience in America. The Jewish people as a whole transcends that. The Jewish people as a whole is Middle Eastern, it's North African, it's East European, Western European. It extends to South Asia, and so Jewish Americans find themselves in a situation in which they have become Americanized. So the question for a Jewish American is, how can we transform that limitation? How can we see that as just one facet of the Jewish experience and not the whole? Because many Jewish Americans miss the whole vision of, and you see it especially with Jewish Americans who buy into, the whiteness of Jews, and they speak a language which is completely foreign to anything in the Jewish tradition. But as Americans, so then let's begin as Americans. Okay. When we get, Strauss said, yes, we are Jews. They remind us that we're Jews whether we like it or not. This is imposed. We need to accept this fact and from a position of humble receptivity. However, and this is where it links up with Murray and the heroic perspective. And this, I think, if Jewish Americans would really deeply open themselves up to the American character, to American culture, they have something which they can then profoundly bring into the Jewish tradition. And this is part of what I'm trying to do. That Strauss turned to Herzl, who said that the enemy is necessary for the development of the personality. The fact that we have things done to us and that we are reminded of our particular Jewish identity, the fact that we have enemies, and again, well, not again, but just to clarify, and Herzl is not Carl Schmitt. He doesn't think that this is that the enemy is in some sense an ideal. But because we find ourselves in a situation in which our identity is imposed upon us, and I think that would be the parallel to the Black American condition. situation that you're describing. The question is, what do I do with this now? I need to see it as an opportunity. And then with the people who speak in these terms, the only people that I know in the United States who speak in these terms, which really brings you from the heroic perspective to the heights of human achievement, have been Black Americans. This is the Omni-American tradition from Gene Toomer to Duke Ellington to
Zora Neale Hurston, Wynton Marsalis,
Ellison Murray, Crouch, Greg Thomas,
Charles Johnson,
Absolutely.
Danielle Allen.
Right. And so I think that the Jewish American, if we're going to make the parallel, the Jewish Americans have to remember that they are a small slice of the Jewish people. But that small slice of the Jewish people is because they are Jewish Americans. Okay, well, what does it mean to be an American? What can I understand? What can I take from American culture that A, brings me to the best of humanity, and B, brings me to the depths of my own tradition? From that perspective, I think that Jewish Americans would do well. I'm not going to tell them what they need to do, but they would do well to listen and to learn from Ellison Murray, et cetera.
It made me think. I wonder how you react to this. So, Black Panther, the movie, Wakanda, forever.
Wakanda.
Okay.
Right.
So that's fiction. Right. State of Israel is a real political thing. So the wheels of history, have the creation of the Jewish state as a project within the 20th, 21st century evolution of, global politics. And have African Americans, I'm going to say this unkindly, living a pipe dream. Where's your power? I can raise $100 million and make a film. And it has cultural cachet because, well, George Floyd. But I can't actually stand up an army. I don't run any banks.
Yeah.
I'll stop. Power. No. The point is power.
Okay.
Okay.
Right.
So when we put an army behind these reflections about identity and essence and whatnot, we got a whole new ball game.
Absolutely.
That's very interesting. Let me just say, if you would, Aryeh, Glenn, I hear you. It seems that the direction of your statement is leading in a direction of kind of, almost like a Black nationalist perspective of, one owning, getting land, having power that way. So, but I'm not calling you a Black nationalist per se, though it's very interesting. When I did a cover story for the Village Voice in 1996 called The Black Studies War, I counterposed Molefe Asante of Temple University versus Henry Louis Gates of Harvard. I actually went to Brown. I went to Howard. I went to Princeton. I went to Harvard. I went to and I talked to scholars. And one of the key things that I learned in that process, among many, is that there are different kinds of nationalism. So I had one cat, a matter of fact, he was an economist. I don't remember his name, but I think it was at Brown. He said, you got to look at it where you're not just talking about a Louis Farrakhan type of Black nationalism. He says there's economic nationalism. There's political nationalism. So I just want to say that even in that, there are, subtleties and nuances.
Yeah, but I'm being misunderstood. I'm not advocating nationalism at all. It's quite the contrary. I'm saying it's a fool's errand in the case of Blacks. In the case of Blacks.
Right.
Yeah.
So Greg, if I may,
please.
I'm hearing Albert Murray at the end of The Hero and the Blues saying, folks, stop talking about Moses. Joseph is our model. That's Joseph, who assimilated and rose to the heights of Egypt. And we're not going back.
This ties into something.
We're not going back to Africa. And I do think that's helpful.
Yeah, I agree. And it's something that you said earlier, distinguishing between me and Greg, which is that I'm at a state, but there's a transition process that gets me to a state that's more friendly to Greg. And I'm prepared to say about Black identity, ethnicity, raciality within the American context, and I pick up on Aryeh's statement about Jewish Americans being different from Jews and the rest of it, I'm prepared to say, in 100 years, maybe it'll be more like what the Irish or the Italian of 1890 or 1910 within the American cultural political matrix, where they were very insular, distinct, identifiable, almost racially, quote unquote, almost racialized, into something now where, you still have St. Patrick's Day and you still have Italian restaurants and whatnot, but it's a very thin. They're wearing that thing. They can take it off in a heartbeat. The intermarriage rates are high. The level of identity closure is very low. So 100 years from now, if that's what Blackness meant within the American context, I'd be fine with that. And I think it is a much more desirable and feasible vision than 5 states in the South, Republic of New Africa, Nation of Islam, kind of a vision about Blackness. So that I just want to be clear, I am not a nationalist.
Well, thank you for making that clarification. But my tough question to you, and I truly don't know the answer to this, is how can it be the case that Jewish Americans and Jewish folks in other places can look very closely at anti-Semitism and track it? One of our partners, the Combat Anti-Semitism Movement, the other partners, the American Sephardi Federation, they track, as other Jewish organizations, they track incidents on a weekly, monthly basis around the world globally. Biased narrative, in a sense. But that doesn't stop them from being, when I worked with Tony Brown, after I graduated from Hamilton College, the Jewish Americans, I was the national director of his Buy Freedom campaign in the late 80s. And Jewish people and their ability to develop economically, culturally, and work together while being a part of the whole was something that was an inspiration, and it still is for me. So how can they still track the bias narrative while they clearly also exercise the agency of the development narratives if we're posing them as binaries?
I think history leaves the Jewish people with no choice but to attend assiduously to the earliest emanations of the forces that culminated in the early mid-20th century in Europe that led to such a disaster for the Jewish people. They can't be indifferent to that. Anti-defamation League of B'nai B'rith. I mean, that's work that has to be done. That's self-defense. I mean, that's a cold look at reality and a response. But it's not the main thing they're doing. It's not. It's one amongst many things that they're doing, but they're also building businesses and acquiring mastery over substantive areas of human endeavor and creating realities on the ground of effective expressions of their human potential. They're not filling up the jails. Their kids are not running around without fathers. They're learning how to read and write and count and a lot more. That manifests itself all the way up to the very top of human excellence. So I don't know that there's anything close to a comparison between the politics of African-American. Think about reparations. I'm not saying there aren't any Jews who are interested in reparations, and I know that the banks in Switzerland are hearing from some lawyers somewhere about some assets that, or have heard, and whatever. So I'm not, but I also know that the payment of reparations to the state of Israel by the state of Germany was extremely controversial in Israel because you can't put a price on my ancestors' suffering and whatnot. I agree with you. We hear a lot about the Holocaust. We do. I mean, I've read my Norman Finkelstein. I mean, I'm not endorsing him. I'm just saying I agree, Greg, that the Jewish people, American politics do play the bias narrative card, quote unquote, to a certain degree, but it doesn't keep them from taking care of their business. We're not taking care of our business. Our kids are running around at 2:00 in the morning in the streets of name a city.
Okay.
Cutting up or worse, and they are vastly overrepresented amongst people who are failing to keep up with the modern world in 21st century America. That's the development project that I am calling attention to, and I don't think there's anything comparable to that relevant to American Jews. That's my answer.
So I know, Greg, there's a lot of charged statements.
No, go ahead. Go right ahead. Let's go.
I think, Glenn, when you go, I think what we're doing here is we're moving into uncharted territory, which is it possible to conceive of a Black American, Jewish American alliance that does not rest on some kind of superficial parallels, really
nostalgia for the 60s and the civil rights movement.
Right. And can we have a tough-minded view of the differences between Black Americans, Jewish Americans, and the Jewish people, and still find a way, grounds for moving together and working together? And I think that the answer to that is if we have our eyes on the prize of human excellence, which I think, and I'll go out a bit on a limb here, which is that American Jews, if they, it's not too much of a limb. Other people have said this, but you can't. And I'm in favor of to be 100% clear. I want Jewish identity to remain robust, and I want to remain robust in a traditional sense. And I don't want the Jewish people to assimilate. But Jewish Americans cannot ground Jewish identity on suffering and the Holocaust, and that's what they often do. And there is not a vision of Jewish excellence. There's not a vision, a positive vision for what it means to live a Jewish life. And oftentimes the interlocutors for a Black-Jewish dialogue have only in mind this vision of Jewish suffering, and then they compare it to the Black American experience, a kind of superficial reading of the Black American experience, and expect to have on that basis to come to some type of dialogue and working together.
Can I say this before you respond, Glenn? This is interesting. In this conversation, Aryeh, you've been, let me just say this, my grandfather, Horace Thomas Sr., he would make a distinction between constructive and destructive criticism. And constructive criticism is criticism with the intent of generating improvement, betterment. Destructive criticism is really trying to tear your ass down, really, straight up. So both of you, I would say, have engaged in constructive critique of your own people. See, this is why, Glenn, what you're talking about, and I know you feel it in your heart, man. It's like you want us to be and do better because we can. And that's why I lead on the Ellison Murray jazz blues example, because in a cultural sense, that proves it. And I want to put that into other spheres of our lives as Americans. And you already have been critical of Jewish Americans. And I think that's healthy because we want the best. We're striving for that excellence. So I just wanted to make that statement, that correlation. But Glenn, please, respond to what Aryeh said.
What I was going to say was I think I have the outlines of the talk I'm going to give in Palm Beach at Paul Levy's synagogue. God help me. So I published an essay in Commentary magazine, the American Jewish Committee magazine, back in the 90s called Behind the Black Jewish Split. And what I said was there were like two things. One of them is about understanding ourselves within the American ethnic political matrix, and affirmative action was a sticking point in terms of Black Jewish interests, and some Jewish people opposed affirmative action because Jews were disadvantaged by it, and some Black people got upset about that, and so on and so forth. It was of 30 years ago, so bear with me. The other thing was Israel. The other thing was the international. So the blacks are identified with the third world struggle, you know, with the anti-colonialism, and they're seeing the Israeli as white, you know, European coming in and whatever. And the Jews are obviously thinking of Israel as, you know, it's the Jewish state, man. I mean, it's like, did you see what happened in 1939? So that I just want to get those two dimensions, the domestic and the foreign. I think blacks have something to learn from Jews about how to make it in America. And I think the voice of the descendants of slaves have something to say about how to reckon with the otherwise intractable and, you know, problem of what you're doing in Palestine. Not that black people know anything about Palestine per se. Some do, some don't. But that, you know, look at, I mean, I could tell you what it looks like from the bottom of the well, okay? And, you know, you can say, no, you can't tell me anything that I don't already know about what it looks like from the bottom of the well. It's, oh, well, maybe I can, you know, maybe, you know, the people are not running around saying apartheid about the division of Palestine for no reason. They're not saying it for no reason whatsoever. I mean, you know, let's have a conversation. I mean, I don't know how that sounds to you all.
Well, I tell you, it would be great to have you on again to talk about that in more detail. I just want to say that based on my study, and Aryeh is the real expert, but based on my study, I think the comparison of the Palestinian situation to the Israeli state by calling that apartheid is a facile comparison that in many ways is an insult to the South African struggle. But we don't really have the time to go into that, you know?
Yeah. I say they're not saying it for no reason is what I said. I wasn't trying to embrace the terminology as much as I was just saying there's a kind of racial dimension that people are invoking when they think about the thing.
So long as we begin with the premise that the legitimacy of the state of Israel is not up for discussion, then we can talk about everything. But that premise has to be accepted. But I thought, Glenn,
Well, I just want to make sure I understand you as a Jewish state.
Yes, 100%. The legit.
Well, I mean, that last little bit is very important because one person, one vote from the river to the sea is not a Jewish state, although it could still be the state of Israel.
No, it is not a Jewish state, and the demographic threat is a serious issue. So yes, my premise is that the existence of the state of Israel as a Jewish state. And again, Jewish in the sense that the French have France and the Poles have Poland. Jewishness is a nationality, and national states. There is such a thing, and there are minorities in many states. And I understand, Glenn, that the question of the West Bank is especially charged. But to have that discussion, we have to accept that we're not going to. The legitimacy of Israel as a Jewish state has to be our beginning premise. But number two, what I thought was interesting is that I didn't think you were going to go there. I thought you were going to say that Black Americans can learn from Jewish Americans about making it in America, and Jewish Americans can learn from Black Americans, from the descendants of slaves, what it means to have a heroic perspective on human life. Now, that's not all Black Americans, and this is where we get into the question of culture. But there was a sense of life that was generated by Black Americans that was stylized into art in the Omni-American tradition, from Gene Toomer to Duke Ellington to Ralph Ellison to Albert Berry to Whitney Marsalis, especially in the jazz tradition. And Jewish Americans have participated in that tradition as well, from Benny Goodman at 1938 in Carnegie Hall, et cetera, et cetera. But Black Americans can learn from Jewish Americans about what it means to make it America. Jewish Americans can learn from Black Americans about what it means and everything that's implied about having a heroic perspective on human life. That's central to Murray, that's central to Ellison. And ultimately, that perspective is what leads us to the heights that we find, the transhuman heights, in what has been produced by Black American culture.
Thanks, Aryeh. I've taken a mental note to amend my plan of attack to go in the direction that you've just been suggesting. Heroic perspective.
Yeah, thank you so much, Glenn. Just one last question, man, and this is something we're going to try to socialize with all of our guests. What do you think the term Omni-American means and signifies?
Well, I think Albert Murray, I think Stanley Crouch, I think Greg Thomas. I think it is a reference to a type created in the cauldron of the American cultural, social, political matrix that, assimilation wouldn't be exactly the right word, I don't think, but a new man and woman created from the flux, the creative energy, the shared experience, the American project, which has these various tributaries, and out of that mid 20th century. And then reflected, as you say, in jazz. And maybe, I'm thinking of Orlando Patterson's essay, American Dionysus, in which he talks about the athleticism of African Americans and the kind of presence of black people and black men. Not only men, of course, but if you're talking about, football and all that kind of stuff. But in any case, something new here on the North American continent in the 20th, 21st century, forged out of the various influences that have the African, European, and Asian, East Asian, South Asian. We'd have to add the East and the South Asians to the mix. I mean, a lot has happened since Albert Murray.
Glenn, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
All right. Take care and keep swinging.
All right. It's been my pleasure. Pleasure.
Take care. Thank you for watching us on Straight Ahead, the Omni-American podcast.
Subscribe today and fight for a future in which the many join as one against bigotry.